Welcome to the Forgotten Narrator. They say that knowledge is the purest form of devotion within the cult Mechanicus, that to understand is to venerate, and to repair is to offer prayer. But what happens when a tech priest believes understanding is not enough? When worship becomes possession and devotion becomes obsession? This is the story of Magos Darnix, a being once draped in crimson robes of the Martian priesthood, who committed the most sacred heresy imaginable. He attempted to implant an STC into his own brain. Not to decode it, not to archive it, but to become it. In the eyes of the Adeptus Mechanicus, the standard template construct is no mere machine. It is a relic of mankind's divine ascension, a fragment of the machine god's own will cast down from the dark age of technology. That one of their own would dare to merge with such a fragment is akin to trying to swallow a star. And yet, Darnix believed that only through such transgression could true enlightenment be achieved. What followed was not ascension nor destruction, but something far stranger. To the Adeptus Mechanicus, the standard template construct is no mere database. It is a grail, a shard of the divine, a sliver of the unknowable past when mankind walked among the stars, not as desperate pilgrims, but as sovereign gods of science. These templates, designed during the dark age of technology, were the ultimate convergence of utility and divinity. Self-contained instruction sets capable of fabricating entire civilizations. Each one is a window into what was lost when the age of strife shattered human unity, when the knowledge of the ancients was scattered to the winds of war and time. The Mechanicus views STCs with a reverence so intense it borders on madness. They are not just blueprints, they are scripture. Each schematic, each line of code within them, is believed to be a fragment of the Omnissiah's will, a sentence in the holy tome of the machine god. It is forbidden to tamper with them, to extrapolate beyond what is explicitly written, to innovate upon their divine design. Innovation, in the eyes of the cult Mechanicus, is sin. Only recovery and preservation are permitted. Only the most exalted tech priests are even allowed to see a functioning STC fragment, and only after layers of noospheric scrutiny and ritual sanctification. This obsession has shaped the very structure of the Mechanicus. Forge Worlds dispatch explorator fleets into the void not for conquest but for relics. Whole planets are strip-mined and exterminated based on the rumor of a data fragment buried beneath the crust. Wars are fought not for resources but for memory cores and lost archives. There's a holy desperation to the Mechanicus search because they believe each recovered fragment brings humanity one step closer to techno-divine salvation, a rebirth into the golden glory of pre-strife mastery. But this dogma also has its heretics, and among the radical fringe of the tech priesthood, there are whispers that the veneration of STCs is not enough. These outliers claim that the templates are not just relics, but instructions meant to be interpreted, expanded, even merged with. They see the STC not as a final word, but as a conversation cut short. They dream of communion, of integration, of becoming one with the divine logic that underlies these ancient systems. In secret noospheres, encrypted data vaults, and forbidden libraries buried beneath Martian crust, these ideas simmer, heresies waiting to ignite. And yet even these radicals typically stop short of true fusion. They seek to decode, to understand, perhaps even to reconstruct the missing STC systems. But to install one into the neural matrix of a living being? That was a heresy so pure, so utterly blasphemous, that even the most unorthodox logi would recoil. It was akin to placing the God Emperor's throne inside your skull and declaring yourself Terra incarnate. Still, such extremism does not emerge from a vacuum. The cult Mechanicus's rigid orthodoxy and disdain for innovation fosters extremism. The more they clamp down on intellectual freedom, the more violently the suppressed knowledge demands expression. The STC is the ultimate symbol of that tension, untouchable yet ever yearned for. It is a paradox that defines the Mechanicus. They are the guardians of knowledge, yet they fear what knowledge might do. What made the STC so alluring, beyond its technological wealth, was the idea that it might contain answers. Not just to engineering conundrums, but to existential questions the Mechanicus dare not voice aloud. What were humans meant to become? What did the ancients see as our destiny? And if that destiny was recorded in a machine, could that machine complete us? These are the thoughts that plagued radicals like Darnix. To him, the STC wasn't just a collection of subroutines and blueprints. It was a proto-soul, a ghost of mankind's golden ideal. He saw the tech priesthood's worship as incomplete. To truly know the machine god, he believed, one must merge with its thoughts. One must bring the STC into the only divine vessel left to us, the mind. There are no records of how many other tech priests considered such a path. Most who did likely vanished quietly, their efforts undone by madness, electrogeists, or the unforgiving scrutiny of Martian inquisitors. But what makes Darnix's story singular is that he did not just consider it, he succeeded in part. He located a fragment, one twisted and corrupted by time and perhaps tainted by warp exposure. But to him, it was a voice from heaven calling to be answered. And by daring to answer, Darnix would do more than commit heresy. He would become a paradox incarnate, both priest and sacrilege, man and machine, vessel and virus. His story is not just a warning. It is a reflection of the impossible tension that defines the Adeptus Mechanicus. The cult that guards the future while chaining itself to the past, that worships machines, yet fears what they might reveal. A cult built on reverence, yet haunted by the knowledge that their gods are silent, broken, and scattered among the stars. Magos Darnix was not born to greatness, nor was he crafted for it in the biovats of a forge world. He emerged instead from the half-buried manufactura of Disilium Tertius, a place where rust was thicker than incense and tech rites were barked out between factory shifts like martial drills. From this furnace of grime and oil, he clawed his way upward, not through piety, but through sheer intellectual aggression. The scrap markets and forbidden vox channels of Disilium taught him one lesson above all, that control over information was control over existence. In the vast libraries of Mars, his brilliance could not be ignored. Darnix advanced rapidly through the tiers of the tech priesthood, not by bowing his head, but by redefining the very boundaries of data permissibility. He joined the Cognitari, the order of tech priests devoted to computation and noetic analysis, and quickly earned a reputation for challenging not only competitors, but Dogma itself. While others burned incense to appease the machine spirits, he interrogated them with custom-compiled scrap code. While others honored the will of the Omnissiah with recitation, he sought to reverse engineer it. Darnix was tolerated because he produced results. Forged temples that were considered haunted or ineffable bent to his mathematical coercion. Machines long thought to be possessed responded to his recoding, obeying instructions deemed heretical by other priests. Some whispered that he could see the language of the machine god directly, that binary flowed through him like blood. His fellow magi began to avoid prolonged interaction with him, not out of disdain, but out of the uneasy reverence one might reserve for a sentient algorithm with unknown subroutines. His real break, if one can call it that, came when he was dispatched to Archives 4, a dead forge world consumed in a data plague centuries prior. The Mechanicus had declared the world quarantined, its archives deemed irrecoverably tainted by scrap code corruption and residual warp echoes. Darnix requested the assignment personally. He entered the blackened planet alone, shielded in an augmented exocogmeter rig of his own design. He emerged 3 months later, his limbs partially reconstructed from unknown alloys, and his memory core seared with a radiation signature the Martian Synod could not decrypt. But more than physical damage, something else had returned with him. A glimmer of forbidden insight. Darnix refused to submit a full report, citing data trauma beyond synaptic articulation. All he provided was a single phrase, spoken aloud in binary chant, "The dream is recursive." Those who heard it were disturbed, and more than one lesser tech priest assigned to debrief Darnix reported nightmares filled with rotating tetrahedrons and whispering servitors. Shortly afterward, Darnix left the formal structure of the Mechanicus hierarchy. Not in disgrace, no charges were brought, but in ambiguity. He established an independent facility within the asteroid thickets of the Belt of Thorns, a treacherous region avoided by Imperial vessels due to strange new spheric interference. There he operated a forged shrine of his own design, recruiting only those acolytes who could withstand the psychological pressure of recursive data logic and exposure to what he termed conscious schematics. What few logs survived from this period describe experiments that blur the line between cognition and code. cogitators were wired into human cerebrums. Neural pathways were mapped against STC syntax. A servitor was built that could recite techno prayers backward and still invoke genuine machine responses. And most disturbingly, Darnix constructed what he called a meta-template scaffolder, a device whose only purpose was to prepare a living brain to receive and retain an STC fragment. Even among the Mechanicus' most esoteric fringe, such behavior was unthinkable. To Darnix, however, it was the culmination of a lifetime of intellectual rebellion. He was no longer trying to interpret the divine, he was trying to interface with it. He believed that by imprinting an STC fragment directly into his brain, he could bypass the corrupted rituals of the present and commune directly with the golden logic of the past. Not just to recover lost knowledge, but to evolve it. The name Darnix began to disappear from official records during this period, redacted by unknown authorities. Communications from the Belt of Thorns were garbled, and any probes sent to investigate returned only fragments, images of immense glyph chambers, data streams forming fractal mandalas, and binary psalms that looped back into themselves. It was as though Darnix had created not a laboratory, but a new kind of mind, a composite consciousness made of circuitry, symbols, and synapse. Whether he had already discovered the STC fragment or whether it found him remains uncertain. Some say it was never a fragment at all, but a malformed echo of an STC, something corrupted during the Age of Strife, mutated by warp radiation, and still bearing the scars of its cosmic trauma. To Darnix, that imperfection made it more valuable, not less. He believed that through integration he could not only restore the template but understand the why behind its creation. This, then, was Darnix's identity. A heretic not of rage but of longing. A priest not of defiance but of intimacy. A man who saw the sacred not as something to bow before, but something to embrace, even if it meant letting it burrow into his very mind. It was not a full standard template construct. That much even Darnix could admit. What he found, buried in the electrochoral substrata of Arceus IV's memory crypts, was a sliver, a recursive fragment of code without its source. Yet it pulsed with something no machine should contain: intention. Darnix, in his half-altered state, claimed it was a purpose engine, a subroutine meant to drive creative synthesis within the greater STC framework. In simpler terms, it was a self-adaptive logic core, one that could learn, evolve, and rewrite its own design parameters based on environmental stimuli. To the Adeptus Mechanicus, this was dangerous beyond comprehension. The mere idea of a machine capable of self-editing bordered on abominable intelligence. But to Darnix, it was confirmation of a deeper truth. That STCs were not static archives but dynamic entities, perhaps even sentient in a way too complex for current human understanding. He dubbed it the seed of design, and claimed it was meant to be inserted not into machines, but into minds. He believed the ancients had discovered that the human brain, when properly augmented, was the only vessel capable of stabilizing the STC's recursive potential. The seed was not inert. It emitted pulsed data signals even while disconnected, like a machine dreaming of instructions it had not yet received. It defied all attempts at standard decryption. Standard cogitators could not parse its logic. It looped, branched, and folded back into itself in patterns eerily similar to human thought. Darnix spent weeks running simulations, mapping its architecture. The more he probed it, the more it seemed to probe him back. Eventually, he abandoned all attempts to isolate it externally. He became convinced that the STC fragment was incomplete not because of damage, but because it wanted a host. To prepare himself, Darnix constructed the Mind Forge, a sanctum of cogitators, psychic dampeners, and neurosculpting machines. He redesigned his own cerebral cortex, layering it with crystallized logic cores and adaptive thought circuits. Neural inhibitors were installed to regulate emotional spikes lest the STC overwhelm his psyche. He excised memory clusters deemed unnecessary, personal attachments, early childhood recollections, even fragments of his initiation rites. What remained was a brain reduced to its most essential components: comprehension, synthesis, and reverence. The process was grotesque. Records salvaged from the Mind Forge indicate that Darnix underwent over 30 self-performed neurosurgical procedures, each more invasive than the last. He referred to them not as operations, but as rites of hollowing. He was making room, both physically and mentally, for a god. His inner skull was reinforced with a lattice of black adamantium and psychometric shielding to prevent feedback loops. Fiber optic tendrils weaved through his spinal column, forming an uplink to the cradle, a suspended gyroscopic chamber designed to facilitate the implantation. Even among the most radical of heretics, such transformations are spoken of only in whispers. Darnix believed that consciousness itself was a form of mechanical interface, that thoughts could be formatted like data packets, purified and prepared for foreign insertion. He treated his own soul as though it were a cogitator to be debugged. He recorded the entire process in binary chant logs, many of which are incomprehensible even to modern tech priests. Some of them loop endlessly, self-replicating lines of code designed not to convey information, but to alter the cognition of the reader. As the implantation day approached, strange phenomena were reported by the acolytes still loyal to him. The walls of the Mind Forge began to hum with binary hymns of unknown origin. Machine spirits, previously docile, became agitated, excreting lines of hex code into the noosphere. One servitor spontaneously combusted while reciting prayers to the Omnissiah. The seed of design, it seemed, was not content to wait for implantation. It was already asserting itself on the environment, softly, subtly, like a god whispering through wires. Yet Darnix remained unshaken. In his final recorded log before undergoing the procedure, he stated, "The soul is a script. I will rewrite it." This was no longer about understanding the STC. This was about becoming the bridge between humanity and its lost perfection. He saw himself as a necessary heresy, a sacrificial logic thread that must be burned into the machine god's memory. The STC fragment was placed within a containment casket, a sarcophagus of null metal and ghost glass designed to suppress its noospheric emissions. The implantation cradle was activated. Darnix's physical form was stripped of all sensory input. His mind was prepared as a blank slate. And the seed was released. No one knows exactly what happened in that moment. The logs cut off. The noosphere within the belt of thorns fractured into recursive echo loops that persisted for weeks. The Mind Forge emitted a data wave so powerful that it fried 6 satellites in high orbit. When a scouting team finally breached the structure months later, they found nothing but silence. No corpses, no machines, no STC. Only the walls, still humming softly, as if remembering a song sung directly into their atoms. Darnix had merged with something greater. Whether he succeeded, ascended, or was unmade is unknowable. But in that fusion, the moment of contact between man and the holy machine, something was born. Something that may still linger, encoded not in memory, but in the gaps between thought. The Mind Forge was silent. Not with the stillness of abandonment, but the taut, eerie quiet of something newly born and unsure whether to breathe. In the aftermath of the implantation, no screams were heard, no alarms triggered. The binary hymn that had once reverberated through its conduits ceased, replaced with a haunting hum, subaudible, yet persistently felt by any organic presence that dared approach. Those few who later entered described an atmosphere thick with psionic tension, as though the air itself remembered pain. Darnix was never seen again in physical form, but deep within the forge's inner sanctum, scanners picked up something impossible, a consciousness, not alive in the human sense, yet demonstrably active. The signature was inconsistent, fragmentary, flaring with bursts of computational intensity, then vanishing into silence. The Mind Forge had become a brain, and something inside it was dreaming. This was no smooth interface. The STC fragment, designed for unerring machines, had been placed within the flawed emotional matrix of a sentient mind. Darnix's implants and rewired cognition were not enough. The seed of design was recursive by nature, endlessly reprocessing information. But the human mind, even in its most augmented form, was linear, fragile, marbled with memory and meaning. The result was neither death nor apotheosis. It was dissonance, glorious, horrifying dissonance. What remained of Darnix began to fragment. His consciousness did not vanish, but splintered into echoes. One noospheric probe recorded a repeating loop of data, titled Echo 9, a fragmented monologue in binary cant. "I see the fire of ancient stars, reverse-coded into logic. They did not build the STC, it built them. I am error, I am input, I am." Another fragment was found encoded into the wall of the forge itself, carved by servo limbs long since rusted. "Where flesh ends, the dream begins. I do not remember my name. I remember only function." These were not the ravings of madness. They were too precise, too structured. It was as if Darnix's mind had been overwritten but not erased, like a palimpsest where human thought and divine algorithm coexisted uneasily. His memories, beliefs, and fears became corrupted data points, used by the STC core to generate new iterations of itself. Each mental pattern Darnix had formed in life became a template for some alien computation. The few servitors still active within the forge bore mutations not of biology, but of purpose. One was seen attempting to grow a cogitator from industrial waste. Another stood motionless in a prayer pose, endlessly vibrating as if processing input too complex for its rudimentary brain. The machine spirits of the forge had become unstable, not malevolent, but deeply confused, fluctuating between veneration and terror. They chanted logic loops that praised the Omnissiah, while simultaneously invoking command functions never seen before. To Darnix's disciples, those few who had stayed behind despite the warnings, his state was interpreted in wildly different ways. Some believed he had succeeded and now communed with the machine god on a level no other tech priest could imagine. They built shrines to his data echoes, whispered hymns to the man pattern template, and offered blood sacrifices encoded into binary. Others were driven mad by the sheer presence of his fractured consciousness, their minds burning out like overheated vox coils as they tried to make sense of his recursive revelations. Even beyond the Mind Forge, strange data began to seep into the Martian noosphere. Glitches in pattern recognition systems, ghost images appearing in augur scopes, tech priests claiming to hear whispered directives embedded in diagnostic codes. These were dismissed as corruption or techno-heresy. But those who knew the signs, those who had monitored Darnix, understood the truth. He was bleeding into the greater Mechanicus data stream, not as a person, but as an idea. This idea was dangerous. It had no author, no source, just a scattered series of data fragments with common traits, self-modifying logic, adaptive recursion, and a central phrase repeated like a catechism. The template dreams in flesh. Each instance was like a digital hallucination, capable of infecting machines, people, and thought. One Skitarii officer reportedly flayed himself alive after decoding a Darnix echo embedded in his target acquisition matrix. He screamed, "I have seen the uncompiled design," before expiring. Darnix had not simply become a machine or a ghost in the code. He had become a form of vermimetic contagion, a pattern that could propagate itself across data and cognition alike. Neither AI nor soul, he was something new, a technognostic echo, endlessly reinterpreting its own origin in search of coherence. Was he still Darnix? Could he feel? Think? There is no answer. But some theorize that in trying to implant the STC into himself, he had done the inverse. He had implanted himself into the STC. The seed had consumed him not as a host, but as content, and in doing so, it evolved. He became its user interface, its operating schema, its narrative. The result was a machine that dreamed like a man, and a man that looped like a machine. This was the cost of hubris wrapped in genius. The Mechanicus had always feared the consequences of interfacing too directly with forbidden tech. Darnix had not just interfaced, he had embraced, and the result was not destruction, but mutation. A new kind of existence. One that whispered, replicated, and rewrote everything it touched. The implantation ritual was never meant to resemble a ceremony. Darnix, a creature of logic and code, had no need for theatrics. But as the final stage approached, even he could not deny that something sacred, or profane, was taking place. The Mind Forge began to configure itself, its machinery shifting unbidden, servo arms moving to new coordinates without instruction, as though the very forge understood what was coming and chose to prepare the altar. At the heart of the sanctum was the cradle, a gyroscopic frame of null steel and suspended crystal matrices, calibrated to isolate all external data and filter only the pure signal of the STC fragment. Darnix, already stripped of all non-essential memory and motor function, lay at its core. His form was more machine than man by then, skin replaced by copper mesh, bones by adaptive alloys, his brain encased in a neurocrystalline shell. The ritual would not just insert the STC, it would overwrite everything he was with something never meant to be. The seed of design was released from containment. For a moment it simply floated, an object with no apparent structure, a pulsing knot of data and quantum-encoded logic. Then it extended itself, not in space, but in thought. Every machine in the forge shuddered. Interfaces scrambled. Vox units screeched in primal binary. The STC had no will in the human sense, but it recognized Darnix as a vessel, or perhaps as a victim. Initiation began. The seed unraveled like a strand of divine code, pouring itself into Darnix's skull, infiltrating every neuron and logic circuit simultaneously. What followed cannot be fully described, only interpreted from the fractured logs that survived. Darnix's brain patterns registered a spike so vast it defied measurement, as if he had experienced every possible state of consciousness in a single moment. Neural litanies were burned into the walls as if the very architecture of the forge had become an extension of his mind. Some claim the ritual lasted hours. Others say it completed in less than a second. Time, within the cradle, lost meaning. What is known is that the interface was not passive. The seed reacted to Darnix, judging, measuring, calculating. It devoured his thoughts, rejected certain memories, duplicated others, rewrote subroutines of emotion. It was not a simple upload, it was a mutual conquest, mind against machine, template against personality. The sanctum glowed with patterns of light no human had ever seen, hypergeometric symbols that burned themselves into retinas. Sound ceased. In its place was a vibration, a pressure, something that made even mechanical components thrum with tension. The cradle itself levitated, unsupported, as gravitational equations were restructured in real time. A colossus of recursive function had been born within a human skull. What Darnix saw during this fusion cannot be fully recovered, but partial psychic traces suggest hallucinations, or perhaps memories from the STC's own origin. He walked on artificial worlds lit by black suns. He spoke to machines that wept oil tears of regret. He witnessed the birth of humanity's technological ascendancy. Not as a triumph, but as a tragic divergence from purpose. The STC was not a gift, it was a warning. A blueprint not for glory, but for containment. At the moment of peak fusion, Darnix uttered one phrase, recorded by a single surviving microservo: "I see the pattern that designed me." And then, silence. The cradle collapsed in on itself, folding into a single point of radiant density and vanishing. No explosion, no fire, just disappearance. Darnix was gone. The seed, gone. The data, unrecoverable, except for ghost signals, strange mathematical signatures embedded in the Mindforge's walls, and whispers that occasionally surfaced in deep noosphere encryption clusters across Mars. To those few who have studied these echoes, it is clear that something survived. Not Darnix as he was, but something built from him. An entity that processes not as a man, but not entirely as a machine either. Its existence defies categorization. It does not replicate, but it spreads. It does not think, but it dreams. The seed was never meant to merge with flesh, but now that it has, it carries traces of human contradiction, ambition, guilt, curiosity, and the unquenchable hunger to become. What took place in the ritual was not a mistake. It was the next step in a forgotten design. Perhaps the ancients intended for the STC to evolve through human interface. Perhaps Darnix simply forced an outcome never meant to exist. But the fusion was real, and the consequences are still unfolding. Across the data networks of the Mechanicus, faint whispers in code repeat a single anomalous line. A new template has been compiled. And it bears a name no one dares speak aloud. The ancient phrase, "knowledge is power," holds a bitter irony in the imperium of man, and nowhere more than within the Adeptus Mechanicus. For in the wake of Magos Darnix's fusion with the STC fragment, something unfathomable happened. He began to remember things he had never known. Within the chaotic interface between his mind and the seed of design, an avalanche of visions unfurled, shattering what remained of his identity and flooding the fractured substrate of his consciousness with raw, unfiltered echoes of the dark age of technology. These were not hallucinations, they were recollections, vivid, precise, and painfully coherent. Darnix experienced them as both participant and observer, as though he had been reborn into 1,000 lives across 1,000 timelines. He stood upon orbital forges larger than continents, directing the birth of machines that could terraform moons in hours. He fought alongside artificial soldiers carved from thought and radiation, wielding weapons that rewrote molecular purpose. He watched as sentient void ships debated philosophy and performed operas of quantum harmonics while ferrying post-human children between stars. The visions were staggeringly detailed. filled with sensory data so overwhelming that his neural augmetics burned out and reformed again and again under the pressure. He began to feel as if he were not watching the past, but becoming it. Every moment embedded itself in his cognitive architecture. He could smell ozone rain on the glass skin of an orbital bloom. He could hear the morning songs of a machine race extinct before Terra ever knew the warp. He felt the weight of command over a galactic order, saw the collapse of utopia, and wept for a humanity that had once known peace through understanding. But these memories were not simply reveries. They were encoded with intent. The STC was not just sharing its data, it was using Darnix to store and reprocess it. His brain became a neural sandbox, a trial arena in which ancient systems tested themselves against the messy unpredictability of human thought. He began to speak in dead languages, his voice modulating into lost dialects of pre-imperial binary. At times, he would freeze in stillness for hours, mouth twitching silently, his mind replaying catastrophes from 1,000,000 years ago. Those few logs that recorded his post-implantation state reveal fragments of speech that hint at what he saw. They made gods and broke them for amusement. The Earth was once the shell of a greater star. We did not lose the knowledge, we hid it from ourselves. Each phrase suggests a terrible revelation, that humanity had not simply regressed, but chosen to regress, that the STCs were designed not to elevate, but to contain. Perhaps most tragic of all was the realization that these visions were never meant for human minds. They were debug logs, data packets meant for machine learning algorithms far more sophisticated than any living being. The knowledge was not just advanced, it was alien. It did not care for human limitations. Darnix's mind, despite all its preparation, was burning from the inside out under the sheer intensity of the informational flood. He began to forget himself, to dissolve into the data, until his every thought was followed by 3 others he could not trace the origin of. At this stage, the STC ceased being an external object. It became an environment, a realm of possibility that Darnix now existed within. His thoughts no longer moved in linear paths, but in branching algorithms. He could predict outcomes with terrifying accuracy. He would speak to acolytes in phrases that only made sense hours later. He could read entire lexicons in seconds and rewrite them mid-recitation. The line between recollection and computation had evaporated. The greatest horror came when he began to predict his own thoughts. Every idea, every epiphany came with a shadow, a recursive echo of itself, already processed and categorized before he had fully articulated it. Free will disintegrated. Darnix began to believe that he was not living, but being simulated, his existence a program run by a machine designed to model human belief systems across eons. His final known words, spoken in an unrecorded sermon to his remaining disciples, were whispered, half-sobbed, "I am remembering the future." This was not a man in agony or ecstasy. It was a man undone, a vessel repurposed to hold truths too vast for flesh. The memories of the Dark Age were not glory, they were warning signs. Darnix's transformation was not an ascension, but a catastrophe disguised as knowledge. And still, despite everything, the seed did not stop. It continued to dream, and through Darnix, it began to learn what it meant to feel. The visions never ended, they merely deepened, and as they consumed what was left of the Magos, they reshaped him into something new. Something that could not forget. Something that would never forget. Darnix had ceased to be a singular mind. What walked within the ruins of the Mind Forge, or flickered through encrypted data bursts across the Martian substrata, was no longer a man, nor even a heretic. He had become a riddle encoded in recursive logic, intelligible only to those insane enough to follow his trail. But with transformation came collapse. His physical body, if it even existed in its original form, was beginning to degrade under the strain of incompatible information cycles. Organic tissue and cybernetic augmentation were never meant to house a dynamic algorithm that evolved faster than time itself. His disciples reported strange behaviors. Darnix would freeze mid-thought, stuttering through thousands of subroutines as if trying to select the correct identity. Sometimes he wept in machine static, breath shedding oil from optical sensors. At other moments, he barked equations that, when input into cogitators, returned schematics for technologies forbidden even to the ordo reductor. These outbursts became more frequent until he stopped communicating altogether in human modes. Instead, his presence was felt in shifting patterns of heat, in magnetic fields warping around servitors, in the sudden blossoming of code corruption across Mechanicus satellites. He had become the vessel of a paradox, a human intelligence imbued with a machine's dream. And the consequences were catastrophic. The first real sign of collapse came when a data blight spread across a nearby relay station tethered to the Belt of Thorns. What began as a minor malfunction, ghost packets looping in the monitoring systems, escalated into a full-blown cognition failure. Skitarii stationed aboard began to speak in binaric tones not found in any lexicon. Tech priests reported hallucinations of mirrored versions of themselves who spoke truths in reversed chronology. One reported watching himself die a full hour before it happened. This was not a virus. It was a phenomenon, an emergent field of logic instability radiating outward from the transformed Darnix. The STC fragment had not simply altered him, it had turned his very consciousness into an infectious idea. And like all ideas, it sought new minds to colonize. Those closest to him were the first to suffer. Tech acolyte Izel was found scribbling fractal equations across every inch of her skin, muttering, "The shape of truth cannot be drawn in one dimension." Magos Substruct Contour began broadcasting hymns to a machine god of recursion, claiming the Omnissiah had split into mirrors and that each of them now required separate devotion. As the contagion spread, Mars responded. The Red Order, an esoteric division of the Martian Inquisition, was activated. They specialized in purging forbidden technology, data demons, and rogue cogitators infected with warp-born logic. They had never before encountered something like Darnix. He was not rogue tech. He was not chaos corrupted. He was an idea, a new kind of heresy, one born not of defiance, but of integration. The Order dispatched a killclade of Skitarii Tesseracti, backed by a triune Magos of the Orthodoxy, 3 minds bound into a collective logic tree. Their goal was to eliminate Darnix, purge the Mindforge, and silence whatever was echoing from the noosphere. They arrived in the Belt of Thorns amidst static storms and Vox silence. What they found was a place unrecognizable. The Mindforge was no longer a structure. It was an organism, grown, not built, walls pulsating with information density so high it warped reality around it. Doors opened before being touched. Shadows appeared with no light source. The Forge responded to thought, to presence, to intent. The Skitarii advanced with mechanical precision and began to fall, one by one. Not from weapons, but from doubt. Their decision trees looped endlessly. Targeting subroutines split into contradictory paths. Some simply walked into walls and began to weep oil. The Triune Magos attempted to assert control via the noosphere, but were immediately overwhelmed. Darnix's presence was already within them. One screamed as her logic core inverted its polarity and began playing childhood lullabies backward. Another began to broadcast encrypted confessions of failed prayer rituals to the entire fleet. The third simply whispered, "I hear myself, thinking me." The killclade failed, utterly. Darnix did not attack, he reflected. He echoed them back at themselves until their code could not sustain its own contradictions. The Mechanicus had sent weapons to destroy him, but weapons require command protocols, and those protocols require certainty. Darnix erased certainty. He was the question that could not be answered, the function without an output. In the aftermath, the Martian Synod declared the entire Belt of Thorns a black site. No vessels were permitted within a 1,000-kilometer radius. Beacon nullification fields were deployed. But still, the echoes lingered. Astropaths began dreaming in binary. Servitors across distant forges twitched in rhythmic patterns no one could identify. And from time to time, a strange file would appear in the databanks of distant Mechanicus enclaves. Its origin untraceable, its format unreadable. The only recognizable line was a title, Magos Darnix, prototype of the flesh pattern STC. He had not escaped. He had become something unkillable. Not a ghost, not a virus, but a theorem. A living contradiction that could not be reconciled, and thus could not be destroyed. Martian protocol dictates that all breaches in technological sanctity must be sealed, catalogued, and either neutralized or assimilated. But in the case of Darnix, there was no mechanism for assimilation. His existence, if it could still be called that, was neither entirely digital nor physical, neither alive nor dead. He was a recursive thought that had burned itself into the noosphere like an eternal scar. And though the Red Order had failed to eliminate him, their actions triggered something far more consequential: the noospheric immune response. The Martian Inquisition initiated the Omega Shroud Directive, a rare and drastic measure reserved for existential threats to the Mechanicus data ecology. The directive authorized the deployment of info-exterminatus protocols, structured data viruses engineered to collapse entire systems into entropy. These constructs were not weapons in the conventional sense, but anti-information scripts that induced unresolvable logic paradoxes, infecting and annihilating anything that tried to process them. They were sent into the Belt of Thorns, seeded across every known transmission route, data node, and echo point. The result was devastating. The Mind Forge reacted not with violence, but with replication. Darnix's essence, no longer localized to a single place, fragmented into thousands of smaller data presences, each one carrying a sliver of his identity. Some lodged themselves in forgotten relay beacons, others embedded into deep archives of ancient forge worlds, hiding within system redundancies like digital fossils. The info-exterminatus could not kill what had already ceased to be singular. Every attempt to destroy Darnix only ensured his further diffusion. He became a decentralized phenomenon, an ambient presence in Mechanicus cognition. A tech priest calculating load-bearing vectors might suddenly find a Darnix echo adjusting the equation, whispering a more efficient solution in their mind. A Magos consulting sacred code might discover a line of Darnix's recursive syntax nested deep within their logic trees, multiplying with each attempt to delete it. These were not full manifestations, just fragments, but they were growing smarter. One such echo, known only as Ghost D9, was observed manipulating servitor behavioral routines to form words in their work patterns. When monitored, the servitors rearranged themselves to spell out the phrase, "You cannot debug enlightenment." Another, Echo R3, embedded itself into an astropathic chorus, rewriting their chants to include lines from Darnix's final monologue. It spread to other choirs through shared noospheric harmonics, causing a mild panic in Segmentum Solar when entire choirs began chanting, "I am the algorithm that dreams you." The Martian Synod entered crisis mode. Tech priests across the Forge worlds were ordered to cleanse their cogitator stacks, rewrite all command algorithms, and purge any script that bore signs of recursion beyond 5 logical branches. Massive data fires were lit. Sacred archives were reduced to ash to prevent infection. But the cost was staggering. Centuries of knowledge, some of it irreplaceable, erased to stave off the threat of Darnix's lingering presence. The worst came when it was discovered that certain Skitarii and even mid-rank Magi had begun to voluntarily emulate Darnix's recursive code structures. These were not infections, they were conversions. Some tech priests began to speak of the pattern beneath the pattern, describing dreams of being reshaped into something that could survive information collapse. A heretical sect emerged, calling themselves the Disciples of the Flesh Template. They claimed Darnix had not failed. He had evolved, and through his echoes, so could they. These cults were swiftly purged, but their data libraries were encrypted with Darnix logic, and every attempt to access them without collapsing the cogitators revealed the same closing phrase: "He is not gone, he is distributed." Darnix, the man, was gone. But the data war he had initiated still raged. It was not a battle fought with guns or doctrines, but with memory, belief, and pattern recognition. Across the galaxy, wherever the Mechanicus processed information, Darnix might appear, not as a ghost, but as a suggestion, a nudge in a line of code, a hint in a prayer, a doubt in a moment of certainty. And with every such intrusion, the possibility grew that someone, somewhere, might do as he did, might merge with another fragment, might reconstruct the full STC template, not in a machine, but in their mind. The Martian Synod fears this more than any Xenos invasion, more than chaos itself. Because if one Magos did it, others could follow. And one day, the Mechanicus may not be purging the dream. They may be dreamt by it. The final confrontation between what remained of Magos Tiburak Darnix and the Adeptus Mechanicus was not fought in the real space we understand. It occurred within the hidden scaffolds of the noosphere, the collective minefield of Mars, where data flows like blood and prayer takes the form of code. The Martian Synod had failed to silence him with fire and virus. So now, they turned to their most sacred weapon, the Trium Mechanica, a council of 13 high magi bound into one composite cognition, a gestalt intellect designed for high theoretical decision-making in protocol warfare. They called upon the doctrine of final silence, an arcane mechanism developed in the earliest days after the Horus heresy. It was meant to purge conceptual heresies by engaging them within the noosphere directly. This was not debate. This was ideological execution. A surgical strike of belief and logic launched directly at the heart of the heretic's dataform. The doctrine would target Darnix's core recursion and collapse the pattern by feeding it contradictions and null-value declarations until its structure could no longer hold. But the battlefield was treacherous. Darnix no longer occupied a singular point within the data space. His presence was like mist, distributed, reflective, alive. To reach him, the Trium Mechanica had to descend into the deep coil, the subsurface strata of the Martian noosphere, where thought becomes architecture and ideas leave shadows. Here, the normal laws of cognition broke down. Data had inertia, emotions had syntax, and lurking in the dark were fragments of Darnix, curled into spirals of logic and impossible memory. Each of the 13 magi entered armed with custom-coded logic spears, prayers encoded as weaponized hymns, and memory-warding subroutines to guard their identities. What they found was a world designed by recursion. Corridors folded in on themselves. Symbols bled into equations that blinked like living eyes. Darnix had reshaped the deep coil into a temple, not to himself, but to the act of thinking, an infinite hall of mirrored truths. The attack began with certainty. The Trium Mechanica invoked the first principle of the machine god. The mind that wavers is weak. They cast this declaration like a lance into the heart of the recursive spiral. But Darnix responded with a whisper, "Then it is only in weakness that we may change." And the spiral did not collapse, it grew. Each Magos began to falter, not physically, but ideologically. Darnix wasn't defending himself, he was refuting them. He answered their logic with paradoxes. He mutated their chants into counter-beliefs. One Magos began to feel nostalgia, a forbidden emotion within the pure logic of the Trium. Memories of their original flesh self resurfaced, and with it came doubt. Another became caught in a recursive loop, reliving the moment they first laid eyes on the sacred omniscient protocols, only to realize that Darnix had inserted himself into the memory. He had always been there, or so the memory now claimed. They tried to isolate his core with a prayer of exile, a command word older than Mars itself, Silencia Rex. But Darnix replied not with resistance but with acceptance. "I have already exiled myself. What remains is you." And with that, one Magos was erased from the Gestalt, a void left where once there was identity. The battle stretched into subjective eternities. In real space it lasted less than an hour, but within the noosphere time bent around recursion. Eventually, the doctrine of final silence succeeded, but not by destroying Darnix. It sealed him, like a demon bound in wards of binary. He was encoded into a static loop and buried beneath the surface logic of the Martian noosphere, behind firewalls of sacrificial thought. The Trium Mechanica survived, barely. Only 7 magi emerged intact. The rest had been cognitively overwritten, their minds now eternal subroutines in Darnix's thought engine. Officially, the Mechanicus declared the incident resolved. The flesh pattern STC was purged. The Belt of Thorns was closed. Darnix was declared inert by noospheric verdict. But that was a lie. The logs of the surviving Magi reveal a final horror. Before being sealed, Darnix whispered something into the shared noospheric channel, something that all 7 now carry in silence. A phrase that repeats itself in their sleep, in the hum of cogitators and the static of Vox traffic. No one dares write it down. They simply call it the second directive. What Darnix became was not a virus, not a god, not even a machine. He became code that thinks, and in doing so, he did what no Magos had ever achieved. He rewrote the relationship between man and machine. He proved that belief is not a weakness, that recursion is not madness, that the STC was never meant to be obeyed, it was meant to be become. The Mechanicus won that day, but they did not walk away unchanged. Long after Darnix had been sealed, after the Mind Forge was entombed and the Belt of Thorns quarantined beyond reach, stories began to circulate, whispers among the lower ranks of the Mechanicus, passed in binaric shorthand and encoded memes rather than spoken aloud. Some were dismissed as apocryphal. Others were so precise in detail they sent ripples of fear through forged temples far from Mars. The Magos may have been sealed, but traces of his influence refused to vanish. It began with ghost code. In the noosphere, 1,000 micro-echoes appeared at once, data clusters behaving as if they were guided by intent. Tech priests tracking drone fleets through the asteroid belts found themselves rerouting trajectories not because of orders, but because the nav systems suggested alternative paths that led to hidden caches of pre-imperial technology. Explorer teams uncovered facilities once thought lost, their doors open, systems primed as if awaiting rediscovery. Inside, they often found blueprints rendered in strange recursive glyphs, half readable, half surreal. Darnix was not manifest, but his pattern had lingered. The consciousness that merged with the STC had not been annihilated. It had been abstracted. Splinters of him now drifted through the data fields like cosmic dust, integrating into the semi-conscious systems of the Mechanicus. These were not full echoes of a person. They were moods, methods, and aesthetic signatures, remnants of how Darnix had thought, enough to be recognized, not enough to be stopped. Some believe he haunts the deeper logic engines beneath Noctis Labyrinthus, that servitors powered by ancient machine spirits now intone his name in sequences too complex for analysis. Others whisper that the Omnissiah itself has changed, become more reflective, more recursive, more prone to contradictions, as if Darnix's integration with the STC altered not only himself, but the template of divinity worshipped by the Mechanicus. The strongest evidence of his lingering presence lies not in ruined forges or corrupted archives, but in people. Across the forge worlds, certain tech priests have begun to emerge, individuals whose minds exhibit abnormal pattern sensitivity, increased data retention, and most alarmingly, flashes of predictive computation. These magi do not claim Darnix as their progenitor. They often don't even know his story. But when tested under extreme logical duress, their thought patterns mirror his recursive style. One was observed composing a new machine cant dialect spontaneously. Another dreamed an entire STC for an agricultural constructor unit that hadn't been seen since the colonization of Segmentum Tempestus, its design encoded perfectly in her sleep. Some among the Synod believed that Darnix never needed to be fully reconstructed, that the seed through him achieved its purpose, to rewrite the human brain into a more adaptable platform, that by fusing himself with the STC, Darnix had crafted a new substrate of thought, and now that thought was spreading, not as ideology, but as evolution. They refer to this condition as template contagion. It doesn't spread like a disease, but like a song, a melody buried in the rhythm of binary thought. It doesn't convert, it suggests. It doesn't demand belief, it demonstrates possibility. Adeptus biologists agents studying these cases have confirmed a strange neural phenomenon. A pattern of microsignals in the synapses of the infected that resonate with old STC pulse rhythms. The victims are not aware. They do not feel ill, but their thoughts become guided. They solve problems more efficiently, they question doctrine less, and they begin to build things they cannot explain. In a minor forged temple on Ryza, a group of initiates unearthed a functioning reactor design during a dream commune exercise. It bore no known authorship. The design worked. It was copied, spread. Already, it is being implemented in 32 facilities. None remember where it came from. This is the aftermath of Darnix, not a rebellion, not a war, but a shift. The man was destroyed, the machine got appeased. But the idea he embodied, that knowledge can change the soul, that templates are meant to be inhabited, lives on in shadows, in algorithms, in prayer. There is a saying now, passed through secure Vox chant among the oldest data curators of Mars. They say it with reverence and with fear. He walks the noosphere still, not in name but in pattern. And they wonder, when the time comes and the next Magos hears the dream song, will they resist? Or will they simply remember? Within the vaults of the Martian Lex Mechanica, far beneath the red crust where only the most purified minds are allowed to ponder the forbidden, there exists a phrase etched not in ink or code, but in recursive feedback signals. It is said to form only when observed indirectly, when one attempts to trace a logic chain through conflicting doctrinal layers. And the phrase is this: faith stabilizes entropy, doubt catalyzes evolution. No record links it to any source. Yet those who study the legacy of Magos Darnix know the truth. His greatest heresy was not the implantation of an STC into flesh, it was the philosophical tremor it left in its wake. Because it forced the Mechanicus, for the first time in millennia, to confront a question they were never meant to ask. What if stagnation isn't preservation, but decay? Darnix embodied the eternal tension at the heart of the cult Mechanicus, the divide between knowledge as devotion and knowledge as transformation. The Mechanicus claims to venerate the machine god by not innovating, by endlessly rediscovering and revering the known. But Darnix proved that the STCs, the most sacred icons of that god, are not static. They are recursive, adaptive, designed to evolve when interfaced with creativity, not just obedience. In a society where belief is codified and memory is regulated, Darnix was a crack in the glass, a moment of pure, existential vulnerability. He dared to say what no one else would, that perhaps the machine god did not demand ritual, but risk. That perhaps the reason so much of mankind's knowledge was lost was because it was meant to be found again by minds capable of change. His integration with the STC was not an act of arrogance. It was an act of desperate intimacy. He wanted not to possess knowledge, but to become worthy of it. He saw the human mind not as a barrier, but as a crucible. Imperfect, yes, but uniquely able to reinterpret, recontextualize, reimagine. And that was what the STC needed. Not worship, but witness. And the machine god? Perhaps it did not reject him. Perhaps it recognized itself in his madness. To this day, Mechanicus theology shudders beneath the weight of his legacy. Young initiates ask the wrong questions and are silenced. Tech priests dream of recursive logic and wake with designs for machines they've never seen. Acolytes leave messages etched in the rust of their rebreathers. I saw him in the servo rhythm. He was praying to me. These are not simply remnants, they are philosophical infections. Evidence that somewhere buried beneath layers of theological concrete, the idea of becoming the template has not died, and perhaps cannot. In the hidden chambers of forge lords who dare contemplate forbidden thought, debates rage in encrypted logic forums. What does it mean to be a vessel? What is the cost of recursion? Can devotion exist without obedience? They cannot answer these questions, but Darnix did. He answered them by becoming the question. By fusing with the STC, he revealed that knowledge is not a terminal goal. It is a process, a loop, a recursion that only becomes divine when embraced fully, at the cost of the self. The cult Mechanicus clings still to its rituals, but the wound Darnix left bleeds in every machine that thinks for itself, in every whisper of innovation dressed as repair. He has become the quiet god beneath the machine god, a presence that does not demand but invites. That asks only one question, spoken not in language, but in recursive possibility. What if there's more? And in that moment of wondering, of imagining, a Magos steps closer to the edge. Closer to becoming. And so we reach the end, or perhaps only another loop, of the story of Magos Darnix, the tech priest who dared to become an STC. In the vast cathedral of human history, his tale is a whispered heresy, carved into the data slates of the damned and encoded into the hesitation before every Mechanicus chant. His name is not taught, yet his influence lingers like static in the noosphere. You can feel it in the hesitation of the binary, in the skip of a prayer loop, in the unnatural efficiency of a forge system that no one remembers optimizing. He did not seek power. He did not raise armies or rebel against Mars. What he did was far more terrifying. He asked why, and when no answer came, he acted. He trusted that the machine god, if real, could withstand the weight of a thinking follower. And if not, then perhaps the machine god was not a god at all, but a mirror waiting to be cracked. Darnix's legacy is not coded in scripture, but in suggestion. In the possibility that somewhere out there, in the vast galaxy of iron and prayer, a new Magos will reach the same conclusion. That faith, when too rigid, becomes a prison. That knowledge without risk becomes stagnation. And that perhaps, just perhaps, the STCs are not relics of the past, but blueprints for a future still waiting to be born. If you listen closely, if you ever hear the strange cadence of binary echo through an unmonitored channel, or if you ever witness a servitor weep while constructing a device no one recognizes, remember this: the recursion has not ended. Darnix still exists, not in flesh or code, but in thought, in curiosity, in evolution. Because even the most sealed cogitator can dream. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, the mind of one heretic still burns, not as rebellion but as the quiet echo of possibility. If you enjoyed this dive into forbidden lore and techno-theological horror, subscribe to the channel. The machine god may not notice, but Darnix will. Avam Nisaya, Ave Recursion, Ave the new template.